Why the Cross by Father Edward Leen, Part 1, The Tree of Death, Chapter 7, First Reading. Only this have I found, that God made man upright, and he hath sought out many subtleties. There are two ways in which the creature's will is made one with that of the Creator. The first way is by direct acts of love of God through the exercise of the infused virtue of charity. The second way is by the practical fulfillment of God's will in executing life's tasks. Man was created, as was seen in the previous chapter, to enter into relations of personal love with his God. By the infused virtue of charity, he could unite himself with his Creator by the ties of a mutual affection. In the direct act of loving, the creature makes his will one with that of the Creator. The exercise of love unites the wills of those who love. But there is yet another way in which man can effect that oneness. It is by fulfilling the will of his Maker in the conduct of his life. Though elected to the sublime privilege of enjoying loving intercourse with God, man remains nevertheless in his condition of creature and subject, and with a definite task to acquit on earth. In one act of choice, an angel determines his destiny for good or ill. Not so man. He does not attain the goal of existence in one stride. His life of trial and testing is not worked out in a moment. Normally it is made up of days and months and years. Neither is he alone in running his course. In God's designs, he is one of a vast number, sharing the same nature and created for the same end as himself. In fulfilling himself through his earthly career, man is brought into a multiplicity of relations with his fellow men as well as with God. A number of obligations arise from these relations. The duties that devolve upon man spring from the very constitution of his nature. What he has to do is decided by what he is. God, having made him what he is, must necessarily exact of him that he act as befits the nature and supernature with which he has been endowed. At the dawn of reason, the child is but a man in the making. Or to use a philosophical expression, he is but a man potentially. His life's duty is to evolve that potentiality and to become actually a man. Fullness of bodily stature and maturity of years do not confer this perfection. The development of the virtues that constitute true manliness alone completes and crowns human endeavor. Being, by definition, a rational animal, man has attained to what is appointed him when the stamp of reason is impressed on his life of thought and of action. It is the very essence of human virtue, says St. Thomas, to incline a man to good. But what is the good for man is that he should be according to reason. But since the child of Adam has been raised to the dignity of adopted child of God, this life of reason must be transfigured by a filial affection for him who is at the one and same time Lord and Father. It is impossible for the wise Creator to fashion a being after a certain idea and to permit that idea to be contradicted by the work of his hand. God could not create man to be a creature of reason and faith, and allow of his conducting himself in flagrant violation of the laws of reason and of faith. Man was made to be man, and he must bear himself as such. If he refuses to do so, if he is false to his own nature, he brings himself into violent conflict with the will of his Creator. The union between the two is ruptured, and man is cut off from the source of divine life. The service of God for man consists in doing the truth in charity. Man serves God by realizing himself as man, and doing this out of regard for his Maker. He is the product of a divine idea, and his function in life is, by his own efforts, aided by grace, to actualize that idea. Man, says St. Thomas, is fashioned by God as a work of art by the artist. What is strange about this work of art is this: it does not issue in its full perfection from the hands of its author. By the right use of its free will, and by the usage of the power with which it is equipped, it is meant to achieve itself. Man is not born just. He forms himself to justice. In becoming what he ought to become, he serves and glorifies his Maker. The just man is the glory of God. He is the result of his own efforts and God's cooperation. As a masterpiece of craftsmanship sheds distinction on the artisan, so a creature who, in spite of human frailty, but aided by God, becomes a true man is a triumph of God's grace. Hence God is glorified in his saints, for they realize in their lives his ideal of manhood. They serve God rather by what they have become than by what they have done. Thomas says, "Who is there so dull of wit that, seeing the upright life of the faithful, does not glorify the name invoked in such a life?" God does not need our deeds. He is interested in the way in which we do them. It is a moral suicide for man, who has been made a reasonable being, not to act in all things according to the requirements of reason. This, however, is not the limit of man's obligations. He has been created for a supernatural destiny. His acts must be inspired by a divine virtue, be upborne by a divine force, and tend to a divine object. He has been created not merely to conform to reason, but to love God. But in his elevated condition he still remains man, and must in his actions remain true to himself. He must still be reasonable, but his reason must be penetrated with the light of faith. God looks to man not only to be reasonable, but to be faithful. Man must not only be man, he must be a man who is also a child of God. Children, says St. Thomas, ought to imitate their parents. Wherefore he who addresses God as Father ought to aim at imitating God. His duty is to avoid all those things that effect an unlikeness, and give earnest attention to those things that create a resemblance to him. God aims at deifying his creature. Manhood is the condition of deification. God cannot deify what is of impulse or of disordered passion, what is unjust or intemperate, what is animal or what is done for an unworthy end. In a word, he cannot deify the unmanly. The supernature with which man is dowered elevates and, therefore, presupposes nature. It cannot elevate what is not in accord with man's true nature, what is not prudent, just, brave, and temperate. Good acts, considered in themselves, are not necessarily either the service or the glory of God. Man does not serve God in performing acts of virtue unless he performs them virtuously. Moral acts, says Aristotle, can be ranked as just or temperate only when they are of such a nature as the just and temperate man would perform. But the just and temperate man is what he is, not by the mere performance of such and such actions, but by showing the spirit and acting after the manner of one whose character is just and temperate. God cannot be content with our doing just things. He is content only with our acting justly. He is not satisfied with our doing true things, but only with our acting truly. What he desires is that in all our actions we should be true to ourselves. If we are true to ourselves, we are true to him. His requirements of us are conveyed in the words of St. Paul. But doing the truth in charity, we may in all things grow up in him, who is the head, even Christ. The significance of these words is now clear. Man serves God, fulfills his will, and realizes his purpose in creating by, quote unquote, playing the man in all circumstances and so doing the truth, that is, proving true to himself. But he must, in addition, act thus in charity, that is, in a spirit of filial regard for God his Father, and for that Father's honor. The terms in which the Venerable Lieberman sets forth the purpose of man's creation admirably recapitulate the ideas developed in the preceding pages. He writes thus: God made us that he might unite us with himself, that he might communicate to us, in virtue of this union and as conditioned by it, the riches of his own being, and finally that we, as his creatures, should carry out the life's work he has appointed to us, with devotedness and in the proper spirit. This statement gives precision to the words of the Catechism. To know God is to deepen and intensify one's spirit of faith. This intensification is achieved by acquiring a more profound insight into the mysteries of the true religion. But above all, faith grows in vitality when a man disciplines himself to a sensitiveness to the intimate contact that God has with his life, and when he develops a vivid realization of his own personal responsibility to his Maker in all the details of his life, in its decisions and in its acts. This awareness of the nearness of God to one's hourly existence provokes the soul to turn with love to the great being who, in spite of his transcendence, has such a tender regard and concern for his creature. This is the way to grow in love of God. It is to exercise constantly the divine-infused virtue of charity. Direct, effective contact of two wills is the primary characteristic of love. Such contact cannot exist without man's feeling it imperative to conform to God's requirements and to rise to God's standards in the daily conduct of his life. If man loves God, and he understands, as understand he must, that his Creator desires that he should prove himself a true man in his dealings with his fellow men, with circumstances, and with himself, he cannot but strive to respond to God's expectations of him. He will endeavor, out of regard for his Maker, to quote-unquote play the man habitually, and thus not bring the author of his being to shame. The reason why God looks for this perfect conformity of the created will to the divine will is that this conformity is the intrinsically necessary condition for the imparting of the divine life to the human soul. This, as has been said, is God's ultimate object. Man finds an innate difficulty in effecting an inner harmony in his nature. In him, sense tends to conflict with reason, and thus rupture the conformity of his will to that of God. Unless the human nature in man maintains an inner harmony in itself, and thus satisfies the requirements of reason, as enlightened by faith, God cannot carry out his designs in its regard. It is metaphysically impossible for him to deify the disorderly. Man finds difficulty in reconciling the conflicting claims of sense and spirit. His sensibility, that is, the inclinations of his feeling and emotional nature, is not necessarily controlled by reason, but is capable of receiving such control. Because man is a reasonable being, the sway of reason must extend over all his free activities. If there is in any part of that kingdom of man a successful revolt, he is found faithless to his true self, to his nature, and to the God who created that nature. He defeats the purpose of his creation. He is, if left to his own resources, ever menaced by this defeat. For by reason of his sensitive nature, he tends strongly towards those things which promise immediate delight and satisfaction, and is prone to sacrifice for them the remote and less tangible satisfactions promised by reason and faith. Ease, comfort, luxury, pleasant taste and touches, sights and sounds, honors and distinctions, wealth, sentimental affections and flattery, indolence and more. All this makes a strong appeal to man and tempts him away from the life of reason to indulgence in the life of sense. Only through the possession of the virtue of temperance will he be able to maintain a constant and tranquil domination over the stirrings of his sensibility. This life of the sensibility in man is often but incorrectly termed his animal life. The expression is to be avoided. Something corresponding to the life that embraces such activities as have their source in the animated organism in man is found in the animals, but the life that man has in common with the animals exists in him in a far superior manner. In him the life of sense, by being brought under the control of reason, can be made reasonable. But even when not so controlled, it has a range, an amplitude, a virtuality, a force, a variety, a quasi-spirituality that it has not in the animal. Since life in man has a wider meaning and embraces all that vitality of the soul which is attended by organic reactions. It is that vast complex of feelings, sentiments, emotions, imaginings, passions of joy, fear, love, sadness, anger, indignation, etc., which constitutes a great part of the vital experience of each rational individual. When a man is said to lead an animal life, this is ordinarily taken to imply that he is given up to the grosser satisfactions of sense. But properly speaking, it is equivalent to living a life according to the senses. This means a life in which the vast bulk of a man's vital sense activity is not under the control of reason, but is little more than a series of responses to external stimuli playing on the sensibility, including the imagination. A sense life is a life of impulse as opposed to a life of deliberate and reasoned choice. The role of temperance is to enable a man to observe due measure in according satisfaction to his sensitive being. But a man's difficulties are not ended when he has acquired the habit of observing the golden mean prescribed by reason in the use of pleasures. He is at times called upon to face hardships, pain and danger, and even death, if he is resolved not to swerve under any threat from the law of right conduct. If he is to prove steadfast in all crisis and never prove faithless to manly virtue, he must, by constant trial and self-discipline, acquire the virtue of fortitude. Temperance and fortitude maintain order in a man's own inner being. The one renders him proof against the appeal of pleasure, the other renders him strong against the fear of pain. But man is not meant to live an isolated existence. Life brings him into multiple relations with his fellow men. He works out his destiny as a member of the social body. He has contacts with equals, superiors, and subordinates. He must bear himself reasonably toward all. This is not easy, for, under a radical impulse toward expansion, man is tempted to realize aggrandizement at the expense of his neighbors. The thirst for greatness leads to all kinds of injustices. A man frequently finds himself a prey to the suggestion that he can elevate himself by lowering another. It is only by the acquisition of the virtue of justice that the tendency to seek aggrandizement at the expense of a neighbor's property or reputation is mastered. Finally, there is need of constant vigilance, quick decision, and unerring judgment if a man is to secure that all his deliberate activities serve to promote his final happiness. Prudence is the virtue whose function it is to enable a person to decide easily, promptly, and correctly what he is to do or to avoid doing in each case calling for decision, in order to tend unswervingly toward the goal of perfect manhood. The ways in which man can swerve from the law of reason are manifold. They are not exhausted when he has overcome his tendencies toward intemperance, cowardice, injustice, and imprudence. He can sin against his rational nature itself by the perverse use of the highest prerogative that he enjoys, namely free will. he is exposed to the danger of taking pride in this power he has, of being master of his own destiny. God made man from the beginning, and left him in the hand of his own counsel. He may, forgetting his condition as creature, aspire to make the dictates of his own reason and the inclinations of his own will his ultimate rule of conduct. His pride might suggest to him that it does not become his dignity as a free being, that his line of action should be traced for him by a reason higher than his own, and imposed on him by a will other than his own. In this, man would prove himself a traitor to true manhood, for it would be to lay claim to an independence and autonomy that is repugnant to the essential dependence of the creature. Man could, by a special privilege of God, be made secure against the assaults of sensuality, imprudence, injustice, and even death. He could not be immunized against the lure of a false independence.